It was one of those evenings that blend into all the others, quiet, ordinary, comfortably uneventful. I had just poured myself a second glass of wine and curled into the corner of the couch, letting the TV murmur in the background. The house smelled faintly of fabric softener and the rosemary chicken I'd baked earlier. Everything around me felt familiar, predictable, safe in the way repetition often is. The kind of night where nothing new happens and you don't expect it to. The doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the soft stillness of the room. For a second, I just stared at the door, confused. I wasn't expecting anyone, and deliveries didn't come this late. My feet moved on autopilot, wine glass in hand, body heavy with the assumption that it was some mistake, maybe a neighbor, maybe a lost driver. I opened the door with the kind of disinterested curiosity that vanishes the moment your eyes register the impossible. There she was, standing on my porch, hair clinging to her face from the rain, eyes rimmed in red, mascara streaked like ink spilled across a page. My brother's ex-girlfriend, the one we all thought had vanished into whatever black hole swallows up the people we quietly decide not to talk about anymore. Her mouth was parted slightly, breath shallow, hands wrapped tightly around the straps of a small, soaked backpack. She looked like someone who had run for a long time and didn't know if she was being chased or if she just needed to stop. I didn't ask why she was there. I didn't say her name. I didn't need to. There was something about the way she looked at me, direct and hollow, that made words feel clumsy and unnecessary. She was thinner than I remembered. Not sickly, just stripped down, like life had peeled away the pieces that once made her vibrant. And yet, something in her presence was still painfully familiar, like a scent you can't place but know you've loved once. I stepped aside, and she walked in without a sound. The air shifted behind her, trailing cool, damp wind and something else, an emotional residue, too faint to name, but too strong to ignore. Her wet shoes left small prints on the hardwood floor, and her backpack thudded softly as it dropped near the couch. She stood there awkwardly for a second, her arms wrapped around her torso, like she was holding herself together, piece by fragile piece. I handed her a towel and gestured toward the armchair. She moved slowly, as if her limbs were unsure whether they were welcome. I watched her rub the towel across her arms, then clutch it against her chest like it was armor. She didn't look at me directly, just scanned the room in short, jerky glances, as though remapping a place she'd once known. I hadn't changed much since the last time she'd been here. Maybe a new lamp, a few new photographs on the shelf, but the bones of the house remained the same. She sat in silence while I went to the kitchen, the clink of the kettle filling the space where words might have gone. I busied myself with making tea, not because she asked, but because I needed something to do with my hands. My mind was racing with questions I didn't want to ask, each one threatening to break the strange calm that had settled over the room. When I returned, she was curled up in the chair, legs tucked under her, the towel draped over her shoulders like a shawl. Her eyes followed me, but said nothing. We didn't speak that night. Not really. A few phrases here and there, but nothing of substance. And still, something profound settled into the space between us, an unspoken agreement, a mutual recognition. A moment stretched across time and memory, and something darker, something unsaid. She didn't ask to stay. I didn't offer. But when I rose to go to bed and glanced back over my shoulder, she was still there, unmoving. I left the hallway light on. In the darkness of my bedroom, I lay awake far longer than usual. The image of her on my doorstep played over and over in my mind, like a silent film stuck on loop. I couldn't explain the weight in my chest. It wasn't fear or nostalgia. It was something more complicated, the kind of feeling that comes when the past knocks and you open the door without thinking. Long after the house went quiet, I thought about the last time I had seen her, at a family gathering, all laughter and wine and summer sweat. Back when she and my brother were still magnetic in public and something darker brewed in private. I remembered the way her smile used to stretch too wide, the way she avoided eye contact when someone asked if she was okay. None of us had said anything. None of us had asked. And now, years later, she stood in my home again, silent and shattered, like a ghost who'd never learned how to haunt properly. I didn't know what she wanted, but I knew I wouldn't turn her away. Not yet. Not like this. There was something about the way she crossed my threshold that made it impossible. The smell of her lingered faintly in the living room. Rainwater, worn leather, and something floral but muted, like faded perfume on the neck of an old blouse. I fell asleep wondering if she had always smelled that way, and why I had never noticed. The morning came softly, without fanfare, sunlight filtering through the blinds in pale stripes across the hardwood floor. I woke earlier than usual, pulled from sleep by the awareness of another presence in the house. For a moment, I forgot. Then it all came rushing back. Her face at the door, the silence between us, the towel clutched to her chest like a shield. I stayed in bed a few minutes longer, listening to the faint sounds beyond the wall. Floorboards creaking, the muted clatter of a mug being set down, a sigh too low to carry meaning but heavy with emotion. When I entered the kitchen, she was already there. Barefoot, wearing one of my old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. She was leaning against the counter, sipping tea like she had done it 100 times before. Her eyes were calmer now, less raw, but still distant. She didn't speak, and neither did I. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary, like gauze wrapped around something too fresh to expose. We moved around each other carefully, like dancers who had forgotten the choreography, but were determined not to collide. I made breakfast without asking if she was hungry. She ate without saying thank you. There was a rhythm in it, quiet and respectful, as if we had agreed not to poke at the wound between us. But every now and then, I would glance at her and catch her looking not at me, but through me, eyes fixed on a memory I had no access to. She stayed. One day turned into 2 and then 3. I didn't ask how long she planned to remain, and she didn't volunteer an answer. She slept on the couch, though the door to the guest room remained open. Her presence filled the space without overtaking it, like smoke lingering in fabric. She never made herself too visible, yet I felt her everywhere. In the towels left damp in the bathroom, the tea stains on the counter, the scent of her hair on the borrowed pillow. We talked in fragments, not about anything real, not yet. Small things, books, the rain, the kind of idle conversation that builds a bridge without making anyone cross it. I wanted to ask what had happened, why she left, where she'd been, what had broken her, but something in her posture told me that the answers weren't ready to be spoken. Her body held grief like a locked drawer, and I, for reasons I didn't fully understand, chose not to reach for the key. At night, when I passed the living room on my way to bed, I would see her curled beneath the throw blanket, the blue light of the TV dancing across her face. She never picked loud shows, only slow, meandering stories about people who didn't quite know how to be alive. I watched her watch them sometimes, unseen from the hallway, and I wondered if she saw herself in those characters, adrift, unmoored, quietly unraveling. There were moments when our hands brushed, passing a cup, reaching for the same book, a casual touch that lingered longer than it should have. My body registered them with a kind of stunned attention, every nerve flaring with the memory of warmth. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was something older, deeper, forged in the strange alchemy of shared silence and unresolved pain. She started doing small things around the house, folding the laundry before I noticed it needed doing, refilling the bird feeder on the porch, wiping the windowsills clean of dust, not as a guest trying to help, but as someone trying to remind herself that she still had value. I let her. I didn't compliment, didn't praise, just allowed it to happen, knowing that dignity sometimes hides in the simplest acts of usefulness. Once, I found her sitting on the floor of the hallway, her back against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and I knew she wasn't really there. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before walking away, feeling like an intruder in a grief I hadn't earned the right to comfort. There was something holy about the way she was breaking, private and brutal and beautiful in a way that hurt to witness. I began to wonder what my brother had done to her, or if it had even been him. Maybe life itself had taken too much. Maybe she had simply run out of places to be. I remembered how she used to laugh, how her voice filled rooms, how effortlessly she used to take up space. That version of her felt like a dream now, half erased. In her place stood someone quieter, someone stripped bare, someone who no longer reached for joy with both hands. And yet, I never felt burdened by her presence. Tired, yes, a little confused, but not burdened. She brought a kind of gravity with her, and I found myself orbiting closer each day. My routines shifted without resistance. I woke up thinking of whether she'd had breakfast. I came home wondering if she'd lit the candles on the windowsill. She didn't demand attention, but she received it anyway. One evening, as I folded fresh laundry, I found one of her socks tangled in the sleeve of my sweater. I paused, holding the soft cotton in my hand longer than necessary. It was nothing, a small thing, a shared domestic accident. But it made my chest ache, not with longing, with something more dangerous, tenderness. I didn't know where this was leading. I wasn't even sure it was leading anywhere. But I knew one thing with certainty. Her wounds weren't the kind that healed with time. They were the kind you carried, the kind you learned to live around. And I wasn't sure if she needed a home, or if I was becoming one despite myself. The first change came quietly. So quiet, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. We had been sitting on the couch together, the same couch where she had been sleeping since her arrival. A blanket stretched across our laps, a half-finished bowl of popcorn resting on the coffee table. The movie on the screen was dull, background noise more than entertainment, but neither of us moved to turn it off. Her shoulder brushed mine every so often, a small accidental press that became less accidental as the night went on. Each time I told myself not to notice, but my body betrayed me, stiffening, then softening, as if it wanted to remember the sensation. It happened again a few nights later, a hand brushing mine as she reached for her glass. There was nothing dramatic about it, no pause, no gasp, no sudden shift in air, just the quiet weight of skin against skin, brief but undeniable. I pulled back instinctively, but slowly, as though afraid to make it obvious. The echo of that contact lingered in my palm long after she had leaned back into her seat, sipping wine like nothing had passed between us. I began to notice patterns. The way she sat closer than before, her leg angled so that our knees almost touched. The way her laughter came softer when she looked directly at me, as though some part of it was meant only for my ears. Even the silence between us had changed. It no longer felt neutral. It felt charged, threaded with something unsaid, something simmering beneath the surface. I told myself she was simply grateful for kindness, for shelter. But my heart beat too quickly for such an innocent explanation. One night, as the lamp flickered low and the house fell quiet, she let her head rest against my shoulder. The weight was delicate, careful, as if asking permission without words. I sat frozen, staring straight ahead at the empty television screen, too aware of every strand of her hair brushing against my neck. My chest rose unevenly, breaths caught somewhere between panic and desire. I didn't move her away. I didn't move at all. And in that stillness, something irreversible began to take shape. Her presence grew bolder in subtle ways. She lingered in the kitchen when I cooked, leaning close to peek into pots, her hand occasionally brushing my arm as she reached for a utensil. She borrowed clothes without asking, appearing in one of my shirts that fell too loosely across her shoulders, the hem skimming her thighs. I felt my throat tighten at the sight, a visceral reaction that I buried under the pretense of casual acceptance. But inside, a line had been crossed, one that neither of us wanted to name. The first truly deliberate touch came when I bent to pick something off the floor, and her hand grazed my lower back as she stepped past me. It was nothing more than a gesture to steady herself, fleeting and practical, but it burned. The warmth spread through me, sharp and undeniable, and I stayed crouched longer than necessary, gathering composure. That night in bed, I replayed it over and over, wondering if she had felt the same heat travel through her fingers. I knew the answer, though I pretended otherwise. There were other moments that followed, each one layering over the last, building tension like pressure in a sealed jar. Her hand resting lightly on my knee during a movie, her head leaning into my lap when she grew tired, claiming comfort in a position that felt far from innocent. The way her gaze lingered, sliding from my eyes to my mouth before darting away as if she'd been caught. None of it was spoken about, but all of it was heard, felt, lived in silence too heavy to ignore. I began to dream of her, vivid dreams that left me flushed and restless. In those dreams, she reached for me without hesitation, kissed me like we had been doing it for years, held me like I belonged to her. I would wake up sweating, heart racing, the shape of her still imprinted in my body. Lying in the dark, listening for her steady breathing from the couch down the hall, I wondered if she dreamed of me too, and if she did, whether her mornings began the same way, haunted by the ghost of what had not yet happened. One evening, we sat close under the blanket again, our thighs pressed together without room for doubt. I could feel her warmth seeping through the thin layer of fabric, my pulse quickening with every shift of her body. When she shifted slightly, her fingers brushed mine, and this time they didn't retreat. They lingered, testing, asking without words. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move away. I let the contact stay, fragile and dangerous, like the first crack in a dam. The awareness of her became constant. I noticed the way her lips parted when she was deep in thought, the way her collarbone curved beneath the loose neck of my shirt, the small hitch in her breath when our eyes locked for too long. I caught myself dressing differently, wondering if she would notice. Sometimes she did. Her gaze would linger for a fraction too long, and my body would respond with a rush of heat I could neither explain nor control. It was no longer about gratitude or companionship. It was about hunger, building steadily, waiting to spill over. The night I truly understood how far we had gone was the night she stood behind me in the bathroom mirror, fixing her hair while I brushed my teeth. The space was too small, too intimate. I could feel her breath near my shoulder, her hand grazing the counter so close to mine. The mirror fogged with our combined presence, and for a moment, I felt like we were no longer two separate people, but parts of the same reflection. I left the room trembling, unable to steady my heartbeat, knowing that something irreversible had begun to unfold. By then, it was clear. We had stepped into forbidden territory. We hadn't kissed, we hadn't confessed, but every glance, every brush of skin, every prolonged silence was a confession in itself. The rules we once thought held us together no longer applied. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one truth with absolute certainty. I was no longer looking at her as my brother's ex-girlfriend. I was looking at her as something else entirely, something I shouldn't want but couldn't resist. It started with a breath, not mine, hers. It landed warm against the side of my neck, slow and unintentional, but it cracked something open in me. We had been standing close, too close, under the guise of reaching for the same book on the shelf. The moment stretched out, weightless and taut, and instead of stepping back, she remained. Her fingers brushed mine, not quite holding, not quite letting go. And then, in that suspended space, my body moved before thought could stop it. I didn't kiss her. I didn't need to. The air between us shifted, heavy with implication, and her eyes found mine, searching, wide and uncertain. I could feel the tension rippling off her skin, the same current coursing through my own. There was no dramatic leap, no confessional moment, just a slow lean, a tilt of her head, the softest contact of lips that tasted like fear and longing and relief. My knees weakened beneath me. Her mouth was tentative at first, a question asked in the language of warmth. I answered not with words but with motion, my hand rising to her waist, settling there like it had always belonged. The kiss deepened gradually, like sinking into something known but forgotten. She pressed against me with a kind of urgency that wasn't rushed but necessary, and my body responded with equal measure. Every nerve came alive under her touch, a reawakening I hadn't known I needed. We stumbled toward the bedroom like people escaping a storm. Clothes didn't fall away so much as they dissolved, piece by piece, breath by breath. Her hands moved over my skin reverently, fingers trailing down my spine, along the curve of my ribs. I felt undone, not by lust alone, but by the way she touched me, as if memorizing, cataloging every inch. My breath caught when her lips found my shoulder, and I let my head fall back, surrendering to the sensation. She kissed her way down my chest, her mouth open and slow, tongue tracing the lines of my collarbone. My skin responded before I could even register the touch, heat pooling low in my belly, breath trembling as I clutched at the sheets. There was a strange gentleness in the way she moved, like someone returning to a place they thought had been lost. Her hands never hesitated, but they never demanded. She wasn't claiming me. She was discovering me. The first time she pressed her mouth between my thighs, I nearly broke. The pleasure was not sudden but slow building, a climb that began at the soles of my feet and worked its way up with patience. Her tongue moved in circles, slow and deliberate, and when she looked up at me from between my legs, I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the blanket as I arched toward her, a cry slipping from my lips that sounded nothing like my voice. I had never felt so exposed and so safe at once. My climax came in waves, unexpected and all-consuming. I trembled under her, my vision blurring, body racked with sensation that was too much and not enough at once. She didn't pull away when I came, didn't falter. She held me through it, hands steady, mouth unrelenting, until I collapsed, dazed and silent, barely able to comprehend the moment. My body remembered her, even as I tried to catch my breath. The echo of her touch lived in my muscles, in the blood rushing through me, in the space between each beat of my heart. After, she lay beside me, her leg draped over mine, her cheek resting on my shoulder. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Our bodies were still tangled, still pulsing with memory, and I let my fingers trace lazy circles along her back. Her skin was warm, slightly damp, her breath soft against my throat. I couldn't tell where she ended and I began, and I didn't want to. The silence held everything we hadn't yet said. Later, she shifted, rising above me, and our eyes locked in the dim light. Her hair framed her face in loose waves, her lips slightly parted, and when she leaned down to kiss me again, it was slower, deeper, a promise rather than a plea. I pulled her close, wrapped my arms around her waist, and felt the rhythm of her body against mine, the roll of her hips sinking with the hunger that hadn't yet faded. I moaned quietly as her hand slid between my legs again, coaxing another wave from me, this one softer, more intimate, less fire and more water. When she finally lay still beside me, hours had passed in silence and sweat. My sheets were twisted, damp with our bodies, the scent of her everywhere, on my skin, in my hair, between my thighs. I lay still, overwhelmed and hollowed out, filled with something I didn't know how to name. She reached for my hand in the dark and laced our fingers together. Her thumb brushed mine, slowly, thoughtfully, and I realized my body wasn't just reacting anymore. It was remembering. I stared at the ceiling for a long time after she fell asleep. My muscles ached in the most exquisite ways, a quiet soreness that pulsed under my skin like a reminder. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel shame. What I felt was deeper, something tangled and ancient, like a truth that had been waiting to be touched. My body had held on to more than I ever realized, and now, under her hands, it had finally let go. What we had done was more than physical. It was a conversation we had been avoiding for weeks, spoken now in the language of mouths and hands and breath. I didn't know where we were headed, but I knew this much with certainty. Nothing would ever feel the same again, because the body doesn't forget what it has been shown, especially when it's touched like that. It didn't take long for the rhythm between us to shift. What began as tender explorations grew into something hungrier, more demanding. She no longer waited for silent permission, no longer moved with caution. Her touch became a claim. Not forceful, never that, but confident, certain, as though my body now belonged to her, simply because it had once said yes, and I let it happen. I wanted it to happen, until I began to lose track of when I stopped wanting and started surrendering out of habit. She slipped into my routines without asking. My toothbrush was moved, my favorite blanket vanished from the couch and reappeared folded on her side of the bed. My playlist became hers, altered with songs I never added, lyrics she hummed in the shower while I stood outside the door, uncertain whether to knock or listen. I caught myself pausing in my own home, recalibrating to her presence, shifting my movement around her gravity. At first, it felt like intimacy. Then it began to feel like invasion. One evening, I came home to find her in my bedroom, wearing my silk robe, the one I never lent, never even offered. She turned slowly, smiled, and acted as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't protest. I just watched, something uneasy blooming in my chest. Her scent clung to the fabric after she left the room, and when I tried to wear it again days later, it felt wrong, as if my own skin had been overwritten. She began calling my bed hers, casually, softly, but it was in the way she spread herself across it, the way her clothes hung in my closet, how her coffee mug sat in the exact spot where mine used to be. Her things bled into mine, cosmetics on the bathroom counter, her book beside mine on the nightstand, her hair tie around the doorknob. And I allowed it, not because I agreed, but because I was too tangled in her body, too used to her warmth, too tired of the aching silence when she wasn't there. The sex grew more intense. She touched me with purpose, with certainty, as if searching for the parts of me she hadn't yet claimed. I stopped recognizing my own responses. I moaned when I didn't mean to, opened my legs before I realized I had, gripped the sheets like they were the only thing tethering me to myself. Sometimes, when she kissed my neck too long or whispered things I didn't quite understand, I felt my sense of control slipping like a wet bar of soap, still in my hand, but impossible to hold. She started watching me when I wasn't looking. I could feel it, the weight of her gaze, the heat of it crawling across my skin. Once I turned around and caught her standing silently in the hallway, eyes fixed on me with a calm that didn't quite feel calm. I asked if everything was okay. She nodded, slow, and stepped away. But the impression of her stare stayed on my skin like a handprint that wouldn't fade. There was a night when she took her time with me in a way that felt almost strategic. Her lips moved over every inch of my skin like she was mapping it for future use. She held my wrists down, not hard, not painful, just enough. Her breath was steady, her voice low, her body flush against mine. And I gave in, fully, helplessly, feeling both wanted and used in the same breath. Afterward, she kissed my forehead and called me hers. I smiled, but deep inside, something tensed. I found myself avoiding mirrors. Not because I was ashamed of what we'd become, but because I didn't recognize the way my eyes looked back at me. Softer, less certain, less like me. I stopped journaling, I stopped painting. I found myself turning down invitations from friends, unwilling to explain why I always said no or why my voice faltered when they asked how I was. I told myself I was in love, but more often, it felt like I had been devoured gently and completely, like a candle burned too low to cast a shadow. She spoke less, but touched more. Her affection became a currency, a language she used to keep me close, and I responded like a loyal subject, eager, obedient, waiting. When she reached for me in the night, I opened without question. When she pulled me into the shower, I followed without thought. My body no longer hesitated, but my mind had begun to drift, to detach, to whisper doubts I wasn't ready to face. One afternoon, I found her reading my old journal. It was open in her lap, pages exposed, handwriting laid bare. She didn't look up when I entered the room. She just kept reading, flipping slowly, as though she had every right. I stood there, frozen, waiting for outrage to rise. It didn't. Instead, a strange numbness spread through me, the quiet horror of being known too deeply, too soon, too much. She closed the book eventually, smiled at me, and said she felt closer now. I didn't answer. I couldn't. That night, when she reached for me again, I hesitated. Just a second, barely enough to register. But her hand paused, her eyes narrowing before she softened and kissed me anyway. My hesitation was noted, stored somewhere behind her smile. I felt it, I knew it, and yet I still let her undress me, still let her enter me, still moaned when she moved just the way I liked, because my body still remembered what it meant to be wanted. But the truth was no longer hidden beneath the sheets. It followed me into daylight, into the way I held myself, into the echoing quiet of the hours I spent alone. I had given her more than access to my body. I had handed her the reins of my desire, my solitude, my rhythm, and now I didn't know how to take them back. I had let her in so fully, so willingly, that I wasn't sure where she ended and I began. Somewhere along the way, my control had become a gift I hadn't meant to give, and she had taken it with both hands. It was subtle at first, the way my world rearranged itself around her. It wasn't about love or even comfort. It was about absorption. She seeped into my days, into my space, into the quiet places I used to keep to myself. I stopped noticing where her habits ended and mine began. I caught myself humming her songs in the kitchen, using her phrases in emails, buying groceries she liked, without realizing I no longer craved the things I used to reach for. Slowly, she became the lens through which I saw everything else. She took over my mornings. I would wake to the smell of her lotion in the bathroom, the sound of her slippered steps crossing the hallway, her coffee already brewed and waiting, like a ritual I never agreed to but obeyed. The bed stayed warm longer, my pillows permanently shaped to her body. Her presence was inescapable, even when she was silent, even when she left the apartment for an hour and I was alone again. The absence of her was just another form of her, louder somehow, echoing through the walls like the hollow ring after a bell is struck. I found myself reaching for her without meaning to, a brush of my hand across her back while passing through the hallway, a pause at the door to watch her stretch her arms overhead, the shirt riding up just enough to reveal the curve of her spine. I stopped pretending not to look. I stopped flinching when she touched me in public spaces. Her hand would rest on the small of my back in line at the store, her fingers brushing mine as we reached for the same item. I let her claim me in these small ways, not because I was owned, but because it became easier than defining what I was. She began calling my apartment ours, at first as a joke, then not. Her things multiplied, her voice filled the voicemail greeting, her calendar reminders buzzed from my phone. Even the dog we didn't have yet had a name, something she muttered half asleep one morning and repeated later without irony. I never corrected her. I never said it wasn't true. Somewhere along the line, I stopped needing to draw the line. Or maybe I just forgot that I was allowed to. Our nights blurred into one continuous stretch of skin and heat and whispered breath. Her body was constant, always near, always ready, always reaching for mine. The sex changed, too. It became slower, less exploratory, more territorial. She didn't just want to please me, she wanted to brand me. Her mouth left marks, her nails drew maps. I would lie there afterward, dazed and aching, wondering how much of what I felt was real and how much had been sculpted from her desire to keep me in place. She made herself a part of everything I once considered private. My journal, once sacred, now sat on the nightstand with her handwriting in the margins, notes, questions, underlined phrases that she had found significant. She started adding songs to my playlists, leaving voice memos on my phone, taking pictures of me when I wasn't looking. I found one printed out one morning, placed carefully beside my coffee mug. It was of me sleeping, mouth parted, neck exposed, her favorite necklace resting in the hollow of my throat. The intimacy of it stole my breath, and yet something in me recoiled, quietly, privately. There were moments when I wondered if I was still mine. I stood in the mirror and looked for the woman I used to be, the one who liked solitude, who moved through the world deliberately with measured pace and private thoughts. That version of me had gone quiet, replaced by someone softer, more fluid, someone whose boundaries had eroded under the tide of another woman's intensity. I didn't hate this version of myself, but I didn't fully recognize her either. Once, I caught her watching me cry. I wasn't sobbing, just a few tears, sudden and unexplained, in the middle of folding laundry. I didn't even know what had triggered it. She didn't ask. She just came over, wrapped her arms around me, and whispered that it was okay. But the way she held me felt more like possession than comfort. Like she was gathering me up as one gathers something that might scatter if left unattended. And I let her. I always let her. She told me I was the safest place she'd ever known. And I believed her. But safety started to feel like a cage lined with soft blankets and whispered promises. I had given her my space, my routines, my breath. And in return, she gave me intensity, tenderness, fire. It wasn't a fair trade, but it was intoxicating. And by then, I no longer remembered what it meant to live outside of her orbit. There was no breaking point, no dramatic ending, just a long exhale that never quite turned into a breath. One night, she whispered something in my ear as she fell asleep, and it wasn't sweet or tender. It was a truth, soft and sharp like a needle against the skin. She said I'd never leave her, not because she'd stop me, but because I wouldn't want to. And she was right. That was the part that unsettled me most. Now, even in her absence, she remains. In the way I fold towels, in the scent of citrus that clings to my sheets, in the echo of her laugh that still flickers through the apartment like dust in sunlight. She became part of me, not through force, but through immersion, through constant closeness, through whispered surrender. I no longer remember the version of me she met at the door that night. That woman is gone, dissolved, remade, reshaped. And now I belong to someone else, not just to her, but to the idea of her, to the imprint she left on my skin, to the part of me that will always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if she'll appear again. And if she does, whether I'll open the door a second time, or if I ever truly closed it at all.